Thank you, Los Angeles. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, Keola. Thank you, Volkan. Thank you, Charmaine. I feel very filled already with the welcome and the generosity of this church. What an honor to be up here on this pulpit where so many esteemed voices for the highest humanitarian purposes have spoken the cry of their own hearts. I did not know that story about the founding of this church, but it's a wonderful one, and of course I'm not surprised it was a woman. I know many of you were probably with me at the Saban Theater on January 28th when I announced that I was running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 2020. And since that night, I have been on quite a journey. This journey began before then, of course. In a way, it's been a journey my entire life, as all of us have journeyed to whatever moment that we are at right now. But particularly over the last year, I had started traveling around the country in something I called the Love America Tour. And I did it because after the things that had happened in this country, particularly in the last presidential election, I wanted to know for myself, I wanted an experience for myself of who we are. And I needed to be up close and personal with the goodness of people all over this country. I remember the story that we've all heard about the man who he's traveling from town to town, he stops at the gate and he says, "What kind of people live in this town?" And the gatekeeper said, "Well, what kind of people were in the last town that you were in?" And the traveler said, "Oh, terrible, terrible people were in that last town." And so the gatekeeper said, "Terrible people are in this town too." And then the next traveler came, said to the gatekeeper, "I'm looking for a place." He said, "Can you tell me what kind of people live in this town?" And he said, "Oh, what kind of people were in the last town that you were in?" And he said, "Oh, wonderful, loving, wonderful people were in that town." And the gatekeeper said, "Wonderful, loving people are in this town too." And that story always spoke to me because it's such a reminder that you get what you look for. And in A Course in Miracles, it says that people hear you on the level that you speak from. So in life, we ourselves invite into our experience that which resonates with who we choose to be. And when I've gone out into this country and when I've traveled, I've experienced long before I started a particular political journey, and since then as well, which I want to share with you tonight, how good and how decent we are. I don't think Americans are any more good or more decent than anyone anywhere else, but I think we're just as good, and I think we're just as decent. And as you've probably heard me say before, those of you who know my work, I've long been convinced that we have far more lovers than haters in America. Far more lovers than haters. Far more lovers and haters in this country, and I think far more lovers and haters in this world. But those who hate, hate with conviction. And those who hate have become organized. And those who hate mean business. And it's now time for those of us who love to love with conviction. It is time for those of us who love to organize. And it is time for those of us who love to mean business. Politics should be a conduit for our collective expression, the expression of who we are. When Gandhi said politics should be sacred, he didn't mean it should be religious. What he meant is that it should be a container and a conduit for the best of who we are. The way we talk to one another in churches, the way we talk to one another in synagogues or mosques, the way that we talk to one another in recovery groups or in therapy or in conversation with our most intimate lovers or friends, children, when we're in that deep place and we know that we got real. How many of us have been in conversations and after the conversation, one or both people said, "I'm so glad we had that talk. We really needed that talk because we cleared everything. We got real." And one of the things that has bothered me about American politics, and it's one of the reasons I'm running, is that the conversation that dominates our politics is so not real. It's so superficial, and it's so, at times, silly. And when you are an adult, you learn that you can't afford to be silly. When you're an adult, you learn that life is very real. And you learn as an adult that life has real consequences. And if you live life from a superficial place, then anything might happen, and some of what might happen might not be so good. America is a very powerful country. We're one of the most powerful countries in the world. Some would say the most powerful country in the world. We cannot afford for our conversation to be superficial. We cannot afford for our conversation to be childish. We cannot afford for our conversation to be irresponsible, because everything we do has consequences. Whether you're coming from an Eastern perspective and you call it karma, or you're coming from a Western perspective and you call it cause and effect, what we do comes back to us. And what our country does comes back to us. And so the conversation which so many of us have had, and so many of us do have, Americans are good people. We care about living a good life. I think the average American thinks about the consequences of our actions. I think the average American thinks about the consequences of our actions on the people around us and the people that we love. I think the average American thinks in terms of whether what I just did is the ethical thing and whether a decision I make might be the right thing to do. I think as individuals, we're okay. The problem is that something has happened over decades, and with that decade has come a pattern of chronic political disengagement on the part of too many people who not only cannot afford to be disengaged if this country is to survive, but to be honest with you, should have known better. And so all of us, I think, need to take some responsibility for the fact that what has happened in our country in the last 2 years with the agenda, the president's agenda that so many of us disagree with so passionately, I think we need to take responsibility for the fact that in many ways this agenda is like an opportunistic infection. It only got a hold of us because the immune system has been so weak. And that's what citizenship is. Citizenship means that each individual cell in this society must play our part. You cannot farm out your conscience. You cannot farm out your wisdom. You cannot just hope that they're handling it. Because I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, they've been handling it. And the way they have been handling it has brought our democracy and possibly even life on earth to a point of peril. Americans are known by peoples all around the world as sometimes slow to wake up. But people all over the world also know that when we do wake up, we slam it like nobody's business, and it's time to slam it now. And when I say that it's time to slam it, I do not just mean it's time to elevate the conversation. This is not just about elevating the conversation. This is about elevating America. We are way too close to the cliff, and we need to do more than just pull back from the cliff. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff. And a political choice in 2020 that's really just a better version of same old, while it might pull us back from the cliff, it doesn't get us out of the vicinity of the cliff. And ladies and gentlemen, we are not living at a time where incremental change will do it. We're not living at a time where elevating the conversation is quite enough. We need a serious, fundamental disruption of the trajectory of political policies that dominate this country, and we need it now. The question then becomes, what does that look like? But as I think it was Werner Erhard who said, you can either live your life out of circumstances or you can live your life out of a vision. So in order for us to make wise decisions about what to do, we have to have a deeper conversation about who we are. That's what we have to do in our individual lives, and that's what we have to do in our national life. And we have to make decisions about what we want. If you want to have economic value and abundance and vibrancy 10 years from now, You don't just acquiesce to an economic system that just sucks from the present, has nothing to do with planning for the future, and just sucks from the present in order to make sure that a few people are okay. That's not how you plan economic vibrancy 10 years from now and 15 years from now. But I'll tell you how you do plan economic vibrancy 10 years from now. You take better care of your 10-year-olds today. We have acquiesced, ladies and gentlemen, and notice that I say we have acquiesced. This wasn't just thrown at us. It was thrown at us, but there were too many midterm elections, too many presidential elections, too many local elections, too many situations where we didn't really complain, where maybe we might have complained. We didn't really push back in the great tradition of America to push back on things that we know in our hearts are wrong. And so we have now acquiesced, we have now found ourselves at the effect of an economic system which is deeply amoral. It is amoral in that it does not recognize that it has any ethical or moral responsibility. It is an economic system which is amoral in that it sees only its own fiduciary responsibility to stockholders as its responsibility, period. Now, when I was growing up, it was the social agreement that a corporation had responsibilities that were moral and ethical to how it treated its workers, how it treated its environment, how it treated the community. But starting in the 1980s, there was promulgated this idea that all that corporations should have to do is to respond to the stockholder, the financial benefit of the stockholder. That is amoral. Anytime, whether you're an individual or a system or an organization or a government, and you don't feel that you have a human responsibility, you don't feel that your heart owes anyone anything, then what happens is that that disconnection from love causes chaos. That which is loving causes harmony. That which is unloving causes chaos. It's really quite simple. And then things got worse, in that our political system became a handmaiden to this economic system. And what this has caused in this country is a reversion to an aristocratic paradigm. Now, let's talk about what this means, because in 1776, we repudiated an aristocracy, and it's time for us to repudiate it again. Now, let's be very, very clear about the difference between wealth and aristocracy. The problem in America is not that some people have gotten very rich here. Some people have produced vast amounts of wealth in this country in very righteous ways. The problem is not that some people have gotten rich in America. That's a good thing. The problem is that not enough people get a shot at that. The difference between wealth and aristocracy, wealth means wealth was created. An aristocracy is when a government consciously and proactively creates policies that make it easy for those who already have a lot of money to make more and harder for those who do not have any to make any at all. That's not democracy. And that is why the late Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said you can have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both. And what we have been doing for decades now is systematically moving large amounts of the public treasury of the United States into the hands of a very few. Now, that's what an aristocracy was, that this country was set up to repudiate. Because the aristocracies of old, the ancient world of Europe, was one in which only a few people could have land, only a few people could have wealth, only a few people could have an education, only a few people could actualize their dreams, and the vast majority of people were basically little more than serfs to them. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, only a few people in America have really easy access to education, and only a few people have easy access to health care, and only a few people have easy access to the means of material self-actualization. It's a veiled aristocracy today, but it is an aristocracy nonetheless. We have had one major political party that has been really taken over, almost, it seems, by this view that FDR called economic royalists. This idea where it is believed that making market forces, short-term profit maximization for huge multinational corporate conglomerates, there are people in this country who think that's a good idea. They don't hate you, by the way, they just find democracy inconvenient to their economic purposes. But we have another problem with another major political party in this country. Too often, the other major political party has felt the pain that this has caused. This other major political party has done what it could, whenever possible, for the most part, to address the suffering that this has caused, but will not challenge the underlying forces that make all that suffering inevitable. I will. And I do. It's time. We don't have universal health care because it would be inconvenient to the economic purposes of short-term profit maximization for health insurance companies and big pharma. We don't have common sense gun legislation in this country because, God forbid, it should cut into the short-term profit maximization for gun manufacturers. We do not fight climate crisis change the way we need to. Why? Because of the obstruction based on the fact that it might cut into the short-term profit maximization of fossil fuel companies. And we do not have a real peace-creating agenda in this country, any more than we have an economic agenda for vibrancy in the economic sphere 10 years from now. We don't have an agenda to wage peace. Our entire national defense agenda, and this is not a criticism of the military. This is not the military's fault. This is the political decisions that have been made. Our national security agenda has more to do with preparedness for war than with anything amounting to an agenda for peace 50 years and 100 years from now. Why? Because that might cut into the short-term profit maximization of military-industrial defense contractors. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something. This isn't going to change until you and I say so. So I have had a 35-year career where I've been very up close and personal, probably with some of you who are here tonight, with people living the consequences, trying to navigate the consequences of some of the damage done by a very irresponsible political establishment. And so I have very strong ideas about what needs to change. I've had a very fortunate life, a very privileged life, and a very varied life. I spent time working with people in palaces, and I've spent time working with people in prisons. I have a sense of how this country works. But not only do I have a sense of how this country works, I have a sense of how we work. And what I'm very clear about is that a country is its people. All that a country is 360 million people. That's all it is. So the same psychological and emotional and spiritual forces that prevail within the journey of an individual prevail within the journey of a nation. So we are in a crisis now. We are in a crisis based on the fact that, as I just described, our democracy is eroding from the inside. We are not a functioning, vibrant democracy. And because we are not a functioning, vibrant democracy, the will of the people is not being expressed through political channels the way it should be. And so I know for a country, it is my belief, and the option that I'm placing before the American people, is that in order for this country to heal, this country has to do the same thing that an individual has to do. An individual, if an individual comes to me, and some of you probably have come to me at some point in your life experience, and you know that if you've come over to my place because you want to talk about something that's a crisis in your life, I know and you know that by the time you got to my house, things are probably not going so well. But you also know that if you're there, then I'm going to be really clear with you, and you don't expect any different. We're going to have to get real in this conversation, and we're going to have to get honest. Because if you're going to go pretending and posturing and not being real honest about what's happening, nothing's going to change, so it's a waste of your time and it's a waste of mine. In AA, they talk about how a person has to take an honest, fearless, moral inventory. Catholics go to confession. In the Jewish calendar, the day of Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, is the day of atonement. The days of awe between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the days of repentance, where we have to take an honest look at ourselves. But when we do, miracles happen. It's when we are willing to say, am I the person I say I am? Do I actually live the values that I say I live? Am I actually behaving in this situation or that situation the way I should be behaving? Am I rising to the occasion? Am I who I say I am? Have I paid my moral debts? And when we do those things, miracles happen. That is our cosmic reset. The universe is merciful. But as it says in the Course in Miracles, God shall not be mocked means he isn't. And so what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that until we do that work, nothing's going to fundamentally change. And we have a political system where the conversation is so superficial. It is so about the symptoms. It doesn't want to get into the cause. It's so about watering the leaves. It doesn't water the roots. Why? Nobody really wants to upset you too much. Nobody really wants to make it sound negative. So what happens is that we, the people, are infantilized. Because no politician, or very few, I happen to know of one, wants to have a real conversation about what's happening in this country, because once we do have this conversation, we can heal and we can start over. We've never gotten everything right in this country, obviously. We started in 1776. We had a Declaration of Independence that on one hand declared that all men are created equal, that declared that God gave all men unalienable rights of life and of liberty and of the pursuit of happiness, and declared that governments are instituted among men to secure those rights. But those ideals can't just be written on marble walls somewhere. They can't just be written on parchment and put behind glass somewhere. If that's all they are, they lose their moral force. In the Jewish religion, it says every generation must discover God for itself. And every generation of Americans has to wake up to what those words mean. Because democracy does not just give us rights. Democracy gives us responsibilities. The responsibility to own those words for ourselves and to take an honest look. I know that's what we say, but is that what we're doing? Is that what we're living? Because even in 1776, when those words were inscribed in the Declaration of Independence, let's not forget that of the people who signed the Declaration, 41 of them were slave owners. So that dichotomy has always been with us. That dichotomy is built into our DNA. That dichotomy we have always, in every generation, just like that traveler, in every generation, there have been those whose hearts were ablaze with what this could mean for humanity. What it could mean to say, wow, here in this place, to the best of our ability, we're going to remove the shackles. In this place, we're not going to say only a few people get to win. In this place, we're going to say anybody, everybody has God-given talents, and everybody has God-given rights, and everybody should have the opportunity to spread their wings. Everybody, everybody. And when your heart is ablaze with that, you see it not happening and you say, no, that's not okay. If you, when you're a little child and you put your hand in front of your heart and you pledge allegiance to the flag, one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. If you take that into your heart, then later you see mass incarceration, you go, oh, no, we're supposed to be liberty and justice for all. You don't just passively go, oh, well, those words didn't really mean it. Is that what this country is becoming? Well, we said those things, but we didn't really mean it. Is that who this generation is? Is it going to die with us? Because if it dies in our hearts, it dies. And that was the whole point of Abraham Lincoln saying that battle was fought on Gettysburg, where those people died. Well, we're being asked to be inconvenienced a little bit, send a buck or two. These people died. These people died, he said, so that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. So we had slavery in this country, but then we also had those who rose up and we had abolition in this country. We had the suppression of women in this country. We also had people who rose up, two major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement in this country, and the passage of the 19th Amendment. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South, and then we had people who rose up in this country and passed civil rights legislation with the civil rights movement. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our time. We're not the first generation to be facing genuine assaults on everything that this country is supposed to mean. Let us not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to get this country back on track. We have to have a very, very real and honest and serious conversation with ourselves, and we need to do as a nation, as citizens. And what I see when I'm out there, what I've seen, what I saw on the Love America tour, what I have always seen, and what I have seen since announcing my run that is so makes this whole journey such a privilege is we are ready for this. We just haven't had a political system that talks real to people. We're like an alcoholic family system where the kids can feel there are things we're not saying. It's like when the children can feel, I think we're not talking about the things that need to be talked about. No, they're not being talked about. So it's time for the kids to say, we're going to talk about it. And you know what? We're not kids, we're grown-ups. And it's time for us to remember, we are also, we, the people, the power is in us. And when we do that, we will have a real conversation. And so I'd like to talk to you now about 3 areas where, in order for us to heal as a country, we need to take that fearless moral inventory. We need to look at what's really happening in this country. If we look, we can heal it. But if we don't look, it will not heal itself. And we're all grown-ups, and I think we're ready as a country. Number 1, millions of American children go to school every single day in schools, many of which do not meet minimum safety standards, some of which do not even have working toilets, but most importantly of which do not have school supplies adequate to teach an 8-year-old how to read. If a child cannot read by the age of 8, the chances of their high school graduation are drastically diminished. If that child cannot read by 8, the chances of their incarceration someday is drastically increased. These millions of American children live with chronic trauma. Psychologists tell us that the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq is no more severe than the PTS of these millions of children. Except that the P for the returning veteran is post-traumatic, the P for these children is present traumatic, because that trauma is triggered and re-triggered every day. They live in America's domestic war zones, and yes, many of them are here. They live in America's domestic war zones where the violence in their schools, the violence on the streets, the violence in their communities is so great that, as I said before, they are living in a state of chronic trauma. What do you say about a person who neglects a child who is living with chronic trauma? You call that person unethical at best, criminal at worst. So what do you call a country that is neglecting these children? What do you call us as a country that we've just normalized their despair? These children can't vote. They're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. They're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. And so in a society such as ours, where our government today has become little more than a system of legalized bribery, what chance do these children have to in any way compete with the clout of multinational corporate forces who are flooding Congress and the White House with millions of dollars every single day? We should be rescuing these children. We should be rescuing these children no differently than if they were victims of a natural disaster. They are full-on citizens of the United States of America. Our Declaration of Independence says, God gave all men, and that includes children. It doesn't just include, we've already gotten, it's not just men, it's women. It's not just white, it's black and brown. It's not just straight, it's gay. But it's also children. They're not our property. They are full-on citizens of the United States of America. Where's their right to pursue happiness? What I see everywhere I go, I see it in Iowa, I see it in South Carolina, I see it in Nevada, I see it in Los Angeles. I see it everywhere I've been. We have the people who know what to do. We have the psychologists. We have the teachers. We have the people who know the wraparound services, the anti-trauma, the restorative justice, the conflict resolution. We have in this area, as in every other area, whether it has to do with the environment, whether it has to do with climate, whether it has to do with sustainability, whether it has to do with peace creation. whether it has to do with these children. We have the people who know what to do. And how does this country operate? Maybe they'll get a $50,000 grant. Maybe we could help them with their $100,000 fundraiser, because maybe if we help them that much, they just might be able to save 5% of these children. If I am elected President of the United States, we will have a cabinet-level department, U.S. cabinet-level department of children and youth, and we will figure out, we will find out, we will look at all of the ways. It's not like they're not in front of us. We need to coordinate not only all of the information that we need about the wraparound services and all of these things that we need to do for these children, starting from the time that they're born. It's not even, it's so much bigger than more money for education. That's almost like a joke. Talk about keeping it superficial. These kids, many of them are traumatized before preschool. I met a high school principal in Las Vegas, Nevada, who said that she has elementary school children on suicide watch. I've been to schools where 60, 70% of the children were getting their food from a food bank. And I've met principals who said that with conditions like those, when they had put in a request from the school board for a social worker at the school, that school with those conditions was not considered bad enough to be able to send a social worker to that school. We are to be reminded that we are the only advanced nation in the world that does so much of our funding of our educational system based on property taxes. And so that means if you're a poorer child, you get a poorer education. If you are won the birth lottery child and you have parents who have more economic advantage, then you are likely to get a very good public education. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to heal as a nation until we face these things. And yet when we do, when we face that, when we face those millions of children, when we realize where they come from, when we really allow ourselves to take in that 40% of Americans are having a struggling time, just making it, food, rent, transportation, and health, when we recognize that these are the human realities beyond statistic like wealth inequality, that's just a hard statistic. And it's a statistic that has been created by economists and people on our esteemed economic councils who, I can assure you, send their kids to private school. So ladies and gentlemen, this has got to change. I'll tell you something, if I'm ever president, all those esteemed economic experts with their pinstripe suits might take some time to retire or have a long vacation, because if I'm ever president of the United States, those economic councils will be filled with elementary school teachers and early childhood experts and all of the people who really know where genius comes from. Psychologists now tell us that what happens in the brain of a child 8 years old and younger, this is where it all happens, is in a child's brain, the neuroplasticity, and the cognitive retention and the cognitive capacity. If you want to see the vibrancy of this country, if you want to see the genius of this country, if you want to see the future gold of this country, if you want to see the future energy of this country, if you want to see the future entrepreneurial spirit of this country, I'll tell you where you go: any kindergarten in any neighborhood in this country. But what do we do with children? We do with children what we also do with adults today. We cap people's dreams. And in democracy, America is supposed to be about unleashing people's dreams. Tens of millions of Americans live in such chronic trauma. What am I going to do if I get sick? What am I going to do if one of my kids gets sick? How am I going to pay my college loans? How am I going to pay for college? I have been in what I do for 35 years. There's a level of anxiety and tension just in the air for the average person now that did not used to be there. And it is not supposed to be this way. And for those of you who are younger, let me and those of us who are not young anymore assure you, it did not used to be this way. Bad policies made it this way, and good policies can take it back. Bad policies. In 2017, we passed a tax bill, $2 trillion, where 83 cents of every dollar goes to the very richest and the very richest corporations, because you know, of course, it's all supposed to trickle down, right, and lift up all boats. After 40 years, I think the jury is in. It hasn't lifted all boats. It's left millions of people without even a life vest. And so once again, this will not change unless there is a massive uprising of the people of the United States, and it changes because we say so. The second thing that I think America has to have a fiercely honest, real conversation about is the issue of race. I don't feel I don't feel that the average American is a racist. I don't, actually. But I do feel that the average American is vastly undereducated about the history of race in this country. And a large part of it has to do with our educational system. But we're a good people, and we do have a sense of right and wrong, and we are a people who want to do the right thing. These are the things that, in my experience, most people just have not deeply registered. The first slaves were brought into this country in 1619. When the Civil War was over in 1865, there were between 4 and 5 million slaves in this country. And General Tecumseh Sherman promised that every former slave, family of 4, would receive what we've all heard the expression, 40 acres and a mule. Now think about what that 40 acres and a mule would have been. 100 years later, Martin Luther King would say, yeah, they were freed, but what were they freed to? So you'd been a slave. Certainly as a slave, you had a skill set. So now you are no longer a slave, but what are you to do? You have to make a living. The old slave owner is not going to say, here, come over here, I'll give you a job, correct? And I think we would all agree that if you have been kicking someone to the floor, you have a moral responsibility that has 2 things. Number 1, you owe it to them to stop kicking. And I think we'd all agree that 2.5 centuries of slavery is kicking to the ground. But you owe more than to stop kicking. You owe it to say, here, let me help you get back up. And that is what not only did not occur, and I think if Abraham Lincoln had lived, things would have been different. But once the federal troops that were stationed in the American South after the Civil War to ensure that slavery would not be reinstituted, when the federal troops left in the South, throughout the South, Southern legislatures passed what were called the Black Code Laws. And Black Code Laws were to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunity for Black people. Thus began what would later be seen and recognized as 100 years that you and I today would call domestic terrorism. What do you call lynchings if not domestic terrorism? What do you call the Ku Klux Klan if not domestic terrorism? So you have, and then by the year 1900, you had full-on institutionalized white supremacy in the American South and segregation. So you have the end of the Civil War in 1865. None of what I just described was fundamentally challenged until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. With the Civil Rights Movement in 1964, the United States finally passed civil rights legislation. Civil rights legislation dismantled segregation, and the next year, the Voting Rights Act ensured equal access to the vote, to the polls for all Black people in America. I want to make sure you all realize that in 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court started chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. And as soon as they did that, all these voter suppression efforts started throughout the country, and we know who they're aimed at. In many ways, the United States is actually now slipping backwards. Mass incarceration means we're slipping backwards. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing means we're slipping backward. Voter suppression means we're slipping backwards. We must take the next step. I'm not saying it will fix everything. This is a multidimensional problem, but this is a character defect that has been with the United States since the beginning. It is time to put this horrific chapter to bed. It is time to put it to bed through fundamental reconciliation with both external change and internal change. We need an integrative approach to politics, a holistic approach to politics, where we look at the psychological and the emotional and the spiritual as well as the external. Yes, we have to look into white privilege and all of those various multidimensional aspects where the heart itself is constricted. But since World War II, Germany has paid $89 billion to Jewish organizations. That does not mean that the Holocaust didn't happen, but those reparations have gone far towards achieving reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act. With the American Civil Liberties Act, every person who was a surviving prisoner, had been a prisoner in the Japanese internment camps during World War II, were given between $20,000 and $22,000. Now, when I have said this little American history tidbit to audiences in Iowa, one of the whitest states in America, in New Hampshire, one of the whitest states in America, in Nevada, and even among white audiences in South Carolina. Every time I've told this story and I've come to the punchline, I've gotten applause. This is California. I hope you'll join me. We need to pay reparations to black people in America. It's good. Good, do you like it? I hope that the ADOS, black Americans in the audience today are glad to see all of the white people who stood up in obvious enthusiasm for this idea, but I hope that, and I know that if you take it in, you're probably somewhat surprised, but I hope you'll believe me when I tell you, they stood up that enthusiastically in Iowa and New Hampshire as well. This country is so much better. We need a politics that gives people the opportunity to do the right thing. We need to go beyond random acts of kindness. We need huge strategized acts of doing the right thing. This business of these little incremental changes here and these little incremental changes there, that is not who we are as people. We want to do big things. It's in our characterological DNA. And we did answer slavery with abolition, and we did answer suppression of women with suffrage, and we did answer white supremacy with civil rights. We have it in us. We need to awaken to our greatness, but there is no greatness where there is not a commitment to doing the right thing. Now, the last thing I want to discuss with you, you know I'm a progressive Democrat, so all of the things that you would expect any progressive Democrat to stand for, whether it has to do with universal health care, Medicare for all type situation, $15 an hour minimum wage, canceling of the majority of those college loans, free access to a college higher education, I'm for all of those things. And I'm for all of those things because, as I said before, we need to uncap people's dreams. That's where your good comes from. That's where your social harmony comes from. That's where your peace comes from. And that's where your economic prosperity comes from. Let people be who they want to be. Let them create. Give people an opportunity to create. Give people an opportunity to do what they wake up in the morning and feel like they really want to do, because people want to create. We want to be productive. We want to start projects. We want to start businesses. We want to make it happen. That's where money comes from. That's where your tax base comes from. That's where your consumer base comes from. That's where your jobs come from. This is not so hard to figure out. It's just we need to own what we know and say we don't just realize this. We have gone from this stuff's crazy to this stuff stops right now. But there's one more area where this country has to have a very serious conversation with itself. And we are the voters, we are the citizens of this country. When I was young, we actually had a ban the bomb movement. We actually, when I was in college, we would go to anti-war protests during the afternoon. The average American, partly because there was a draft at that time, the average American took very seriously what we were doing internationally. Now we've just kind of like, whatever. It's too difficult to think about. We just hope they're doing the right thing. Let me give you a little bit tidbit. No, they're not. So the national security agenda of the United States, as I said before, is not based on a plan of peace, not based on peace creation. To create peace, there are specific factors. This is not a mystery. There are 4 major factors where, when they are present, it is statistically proven that violence is reduced and peace is increased. None of this is going to shock you. Number 1, expanded economic opportunities for women. Number 2, expanded educational opportunities for children. Number 3, reduction of violence against women. And number 4, the amelioration of unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. We should see large groups of desperate people as a national security risk, because desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces, whether it has to do with gang membership in a city of the United States or a terrorist organization somewhere around the world, or an authoritarian demagogue right here in the United States. What do you think those people at the border? You think those people, some woman who's going to try to trek 1,000 miles over a desert with baby in her arms, did so because things were going well? Has the average American stopped really to consider the level of despair that these people, whether it's in Guatemala or Honduras or anything like that, are enduring in their countries in order to create these kind of conditions? This is what the United States should be about. We should be about moral leadership. We should be about using our power, not just for us, but for future generations as well. Not just for us, but for people around the world. There was a time when people saw the United States as a shining light of moral leadership. They do not any longer. The Dalai Lama himself told me that. We must stand again for democratic principles around this world. We must stand again for humanitarian principles around this world. We instead are a country that for the sake of $100 billion would sell arms to that Saudi Arabian prince who is using that for the aerial support that he needs to prosecute that war against the Yemenis, where tens of thousands of people have starved to death, many of them children. And who are we? Who are we if we just aren't looking? And to the extent to which was even brought up, our Secretary of State said, well, he said we can have strategic partnerships with people who do not share our values. Ladies and gentlemen, no, you can't. That means you have sacrificed your values. That means you're nothing but a whore. That's all it means. For every dollar that this country spends on genuine peace creation methods such as those I mentioned, expanding economic opportunities for women, decreasing violence against women, etc., for every dollar we spend on those things which are proven to be far more efficacious in terms of creating peace than anything that a brute force can do, for every dollar that we spend on peace creation, we spend $1,000 and more on things that have to do with preparedness for war. We have military buys that the military itself didn't even ask for. I have great respect for the military. I think we should. This is not a criticism of the military. These are political decisions that have nothing to do with planning for peace. It is about planning for money, money, money for the sake of a few people. And I want to share with you one fact, because maybe you don't know it, and if you don't know it, it's not going to make you feel good, but it's like Werner Erhard said, the truth will set you free, but not immediately. First, it might piss you off. So this is the truth. Our United States Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes called the B-21 Raider. The B-21 Raiders, each one costs $550 million, and each one carries both conventional and nuclear weapons. Now, the founder said this is supposed to be yours to decide and to think about, not anybody else. So I'm asking you, I'm just asking you as a human being, why do we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear bombs? You drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization the way anything that we know. You drop 10 of those, it's over for humanity on this earth for 200,000-300,000 years. 100 airplanes that drop nukes. Ladies and gentlemen, that has nothing to do with an agenda of peace. All that has to do with is an agenda of billions of dollars for the nuclear defense industry and defense contractors. And that's how this country runs today. And it's deeply corrupt. And this is not something to hate our country for. It is something which, because we love our country, we will change. Cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. And whining is not an option. What is an option is that we rise up. What is an option is that we, each of us, ask ourselves, what can I do? What is the part for me to play? Just as in the immune cell, every cell is assigned, you to the heart, you to the bones, you to the spleen. Every cell has its function in order to collaborate with other cells in order to serve the healthy function of the whole. Gandhi said that the leader of the Indian independence movement is the small, still voice within. I'm not running against anybody. I'm running with a lot of really great people. And I don't know if Californians have totally registered that California now is very, very important in the primary season. Because where it used to be that the ones that really mattered were Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada, all of which I'm spending a lot of time in, California now, because you can begin early voting the day that the Iowa primary happens on February 3rd, their caucus, get that words right, the primary versus the caucus, theirs is on February 3rd next year. That is when you, as Californians, will be able to begin early voting. Now, what I find in Iowa and what I find in New Hampshire, what I find in South Carolina, what I find in Nevada, and what I think I will find soon here in California is a deep realization on the part of people in those states that they're very important because they will be making the decisions that will dominate the American political conversation and thus much of the history of the world for years to come. Each of us, I believe in that small, still voice within. I believe that each of us, if we ask, will find direction for how we might best help, how we might best serve, how we might best collaborate with others to serve the healthy functioning of the whole. When I ask my still voice within, I got run for president. And if you feel you're going to be listening to a lot of good, smart people all year who are running for this office. And I hope that you will. And I hope that you will think very, very deeply about all of these things. But if, less than a year from now, you feel in your own heart, in your small, still voice within, that the good thing for you to do would be to vote for me, I will not be very honored only. I will not only be very privileged. I will work like hell. Thank you. Thank you! Thank you, thank you. Thank you! Thank you so much. Thank you! Thank you! Thank you, thank you, thank you! Thank you. Thank you! Thank you. Thank you so much.